All right. To everyone drawn to the eerie, the unsettling, and the downright unexplainable, you're in the right place. If you live for stories that send chills racing down your spine and linger in your thoughts long after the lights go out, then get comfortable, because this one hits different. Before we dive in, I've got to ask, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it on your end? The stories? A camper's forgotten tape exposed the real reason they closed the park. The old park had been shut for years after a string of unexplained incidents that locals still mentioned in quiet tones. The only solid clue ever discussed came from a small camcorder tape found inside a forgotten overnight pack near the North Trail. The story followed a 26-year-old school technician named Lyle Rooker, who visited the park in early autumn of 2019. He worked long weeks in a crowded lab and wanted one quiet weekend before the winter rush returned. He drove out early on a Friday, hoping to film some wildlife and maybe catch a quiet sunrise near the ridge. Lyle picked a simple loop near a small lake and planned to reach a clearing before dark so he could set up his camp. He checked the weather, loaded his pack, then started the trail with a relaxed pace that matched the quiet feel of the woods. The place had been thinning in visitors for years, and he enjoyed the stillness while he walked toward the lake. The incident started when he noticed a narrow side path marked only by faded blue tape tied around a leaning pine. He looked at his printed map and saw no hint of that path, even though it seemed recently used by something heavy. The ground showed deep impressions and a few dragged lines that he could not match with normal hiker traffic. Lyle moved closer to inspect the impressions, and he recorded a brief clip while he knelt near the dirt with the camcorder. Witness statements later noted that his voice sounded uneasy when he said he might return later to check the full length of the side path. He continued toward the lake, though he kept glancing back with a nervous expression that showed in later recovered frames. When he reached the clearing, he met a retired ranger named Colton Reeves, who often walked the trail for exercise. Colton warned him about stray dogs reported near the ridge and advised him to stay on the main path if he heard anything heavy moving. Lyle agreed, though he mentioned the strange impressions near the pine. Colton seemed unsettled by that detail and said he had not seen blue tape in that area before. That short exchange later became an important piece of the investigation because Colton described Lyle as alert and fully oriented. Dispatch logs showed that the ranger left the clearing around the same time Lyle began setting up his small tent beside the lake. The sun was dropping behind the ridge, and he recorded a simple note saying he would return home early Sunday. The complication began when distant knocks echoed across the water after sunset. The tape captured 3 sharp hits, followed by a slow dragging sound that rolled through the trees. Lyle whispered a short question, asking if someone was swinging tools, but no voice answered before the sound faded. He stepped outside with the camcorder, and the footage trembled slightly while he walked toward the shoreline. That part of the tape showed ripples moving across the lake, though the surface looked calm seconds earlier. A dim shape crossed from right to left near the far bank, but the frame blurred before any exact detail formed. Investigators later judged the shape to be human-sized, though they could not confirm height or posture. Lyle backed away, and he ended the clip with a quick excuse that he needed more light. Evidence gathered from his tent indicated he tried to sleep but stayed awake most of the night. His pack remained open, and he had placed the camcorder near the entrance so he could reach it quickly. Around 2 in the morning, a second set of knocks started. The tape recorded them with clearer tone, and they sounded closer to the clearing than before. Lyle stepped out and aimed the camcorder toward the trees near the side path. The audio picked up cracking undergrowth along with short breaths that suggested he was frightened, yet still curious enough to film. Then a faint voice appeared near the edge of the microphone range. The voice asked if anyone had seen the dog from the ridge and repeated the question twice. Investigators matched the voice to a missing hiker reported 3 seasons earlier, according to archived calls. That hiker had vanished during a late storm near the North Trail, and his final message referenced a stray dog that followed him across the ridge. The match was considered probable, though never confirmed, because the audio was worn with age. Lyle walked a few steps toward the sound, though he kept enough distance for a quick retreat. The tape showed a tall figure standing between 2 pines with an odd tilt at the shoulders. The figure swayed slowly, as if injured, and the lower right side appeared fixed in a stiff angle. Lyle asked if the person needed help. The voice did not answer, and the figure moved further into the trees without showing its face. The investigation deepened when rangers found Lyle's camp untouched the following afternoon, with his tent still upright and his food sealed. His phone lay inside the tent with 2 attempted calls made around 3 that morning. The calls never connected due to weak signal. The camcorder was found near the base of the leaning pine where the faint blue tape had been tied. Search teams followed the side path and found more deep impressions along with a torn jacket fragment that matched the missing hiker's clothing from 3 seasons earlier. The fragment was caught on a low branch roughly 20 yards from where Lyle recorded the swaying figure. Soil samples indicated repeated movement through that area, though not enough to identify specific tracks. The twist emerged when investigators compared Lyle's final clip with an older wildlife survey recorded 6 years earlier. Both clips captured the same faint voice asking about the dog near the ridge. The survey team noted the voice, but assumed it came from campers beyond the tree line. The match suggested a pattern of someone or something calling from the same area across multiple years. The official report stated that the park remained unsafe due to unstable terrain near the North Trail and ongoing search efforts tied to older missing persons cases. Unofficially, several rangers believed the repeated voice signaled a person who wandered off the main path and survived through unknown means. They felt the figure avoided help and followed hikers who entered the side path after dark. Lyle was never found despite extensive searches that covered every marked route and several unmarked stretches. His camcorder tape became the final recorded clue, showing his calm approach that shifted to rising fear as the figure moved away. The park closed soon after officials reviewed the tapes and compared them with archived survey audio. The case left a quiet note in local reports, stating that people sometimes leave trails for reasons no one fully understands. The forgotten tape remained the clearest glimpse into those final hours, and it shaped the quiet acceptance that the park would not reopen in the near future. The closing line on the internal report stated that some paths stay hidden for good reasons, and not every question finds a safe answer. The stories. The fisherman who kept hearing his name over the radio. Evan Carr spent most mornings on the narrow inlet where the water carried old radio chatter from nearby boats. Local crews reported that odd transmissions sometimes drifted through that stretch, and many believed they came from abandoned gear left after storms. He treated those stories like tired dock rumors until one calm morning changed his thinking. Evan was 38 and worked as a small-scale fisherman who supplied a few markets inland. He kept his aluminum skiff tied near the inlet because the currents stayed gentle and the tides rarely pushed hard. He headed out around sunrise on a day in early summer 2019 with a simple goal to check crab pots he set the night before. He liked the quiet and usually ignored the static coming from his battered radio. He started the motor, then steered toward his first buoy, while soft wind pushed light ripples across the inlet. He reached for his thermos when the radio cracked with a burst sharper than usual, which made him pause. Static hissed for several seconds, then a faint voice said his name with a slow, careful tone. It sounded like a person trying to speak through heavy interference. Evan thought it came from a nearby boat because signals often bounced across the water in unpredictable ways. He looked around but saw empty shoreline and one distant trawler that was already moving toward deeper water. The voice repeated his name with the same drawn-out sound, and he felt a sudden cold weight that did not match the warm morning. He tried to answer, but the radio only returned a faint hum that flicked in and out like something powered by a weak battery. He shut the radio off to reset it, then turned it back on, hoping the strange signal would vanish. Instead, he heard a low, rhythmic tapping that reminded him of someone hitting a metal hull in slow, measured beats. Evan finished checking the first pot, but his focus kept drifting to the radio because the voice carried a dull echo that felt unnatural. He tied the pot and planned to finish the rest quickly so he could return to shore where he hoped to test the antenna. The moment he reached for the throttle, the radio shifted again and whispered his name in a tone that sounded closer than before. He headed towards shore while replaying that voice in his mind because it carried an uneasy familiarity he could not place. Dock workers later said he arrived faster than usual and looked tense as he pulled his gear onto the planks. He asked if any boat had called for him that morning, but no one reported a transmission with his name. Evan returned home and wrote down the time of each strange broadcast because he wanted to check older notes he kept on similar events. He found 2 entries from early spring that mentioned brief whispers through the radio shortly after heavy fog settled over the inlet. He ignored them at the time because the fog distorted signals and created odd echoes that bounced between cliffs. He spent the afternoon checking online forums that tracked regional marine frequencies where enthusiasts archived recordings from previous seasons. One contributor posted a thread about ghost transmissions that came from a derelict trawler that sank in the late 2010s after a major storm. According to the thread, the trawler carried a short-range radio that sometimes flickered on during low tide when exposed wiring reacted to saltwater. Witness statements from local patrol crews reported faint voices calling crew names during those periods, though no identity was ever confirmed. Evan noted that detail because the thread mentioned distorted speech patterns that matched his morning experience. He called a friend named Cal Rowan, who worked part-time with a small rescue group, and asked if the inlet held any wrecks near his route. Cal said an old survey map showed one submerged boat that rested near the deeper bend south of the inlet. He offered to meet Evan at the dock so they could check tidal charts and mark the likely location. They met near sunset and compared notes while a light breeze pushed the smell of seaweed across the planks. Cal studied Evan's written times, then said the pattern lined up with a recent series of reports about intermittent transmissions during rising tide. He suggested they record any new signal the next morning using a portable device with stronger range than Evan's aging radio. Evan agreed, even though the idea made him uneasy because the voice felt personal in a way he could not explain. Morning arrived with heavy gray sky as they motored toward the bend marked on the survey map. Evan turned on the recorder while Cal monitored the radio and watched the water shift with the incoming tide. They waited for several minutes before a burst of static cracked through the speaker with a sharp rise that made both men flinch. The voice spoke again and said Evan's name with a tone that now carried a clipped urgency. Cal looked at the recorder, then stared toward the bend because the voice sounded as if it came from somewhere below the surface. Evan gripped the wheel and tried to steady his breathing because something in the tone reminded him of an old coworker who vanished years earlier during a late-season crossing. He mentioned that coworker to Cal, who asked if the man ever sailed near this inlet. Evan said that the coworker named Reed had worked on a small crew that fished along the same coastline in early 2017. Reed later transferred to another vessel that sank during a storm that occurred north of their town. Local reports said the wreck was never fully recovered because shifting sand made the search difficult. Cal suggested they check archived dispatch logs from that storm because crews sometimes reported drifting debris that could help them understand how anything connected to Reed might reach this inlet. They returned to shore and visited a small office where a retired dispatcher kept scanned records from older calls. The dispatcher recognized Evan and allowed them to search a digital folder that stored logs from early 2017. One log described a partial sighting of a damaged trawler hull drifting south several days after the storm. The report said the hull carried broken antennas and fragments of a radio panel that still flickered when exposed to sunlight. A second log mentioned a patrol officer hearing a distant voice through static that repeated a crew name before fading. Evan realized the name in that report matched Reed's last name, but the log did not mention if the voice said anything else. He remembered that Reed had a habit of calling coworkers by last name during early morning shifts when he tried to stay awake. The connection felt loose but too strong to ignore because the timing aligned with the drifting hull. Cal said they should return to the inlet during low tide because exposed wreckage might reveal old wiring that caused recent broadcasts. Evan agreed, though, his stomach tightened because the voice spoke with increasing clarity each time. They secured the skiff, then returned that afternoon when the tide receded and revealed dark shapes below the bend. They anchored near a shallow patch where twisted metal poked through sand like remnants from the storm. Evan moved closer and saw part of a radio panel caught between two rusted beams with wires trailing into the water. Cal used a long hook to lift a loose section and found a corroded tag that matched the radio model used on Reed's crew during 2017. The radio crackled at that moment, then delivered another faint call of Evan's name, with a tone that now carried slow rising static. Cal recorded the sound while Evan watched the wires shift with the gentle pull of the tide. He understood then that the wrecked panels sometimes connected when saltwater reached the exposed terminals, which created a short burst of power. The burst likely triggered fragments of an old emergency recording that captured voices during the storm. Evan remembered that some crews recorded internal chatter before impact, and those recordings sometimes contained rushed calls that repeated crew names. The voice in his radio may have been part of that final chatter, which echoed through damaged wiring each time conditions aligned. They brought the recording to the dispatcher, who played it through a clearer speaker. The voice echoed sharply, then faded as the static rose, which made the source obvious. It was a broken emergency loop that repeated fragments from a doomed crew's final minutes. The distorted tone made the calls sound directed, but they were simply names shouted during chaos. Evan felt a heavy release of tension because the mystery carried a painful answer, but at least it was grounded in something real. He asked the dispatcher to contact local authorities so they could mark the wreck and prevent more confusion. Cal agreed and said the inlet should be flagged on new charts for safety. Evan returned to the water the next day and listened to his radio with a calmer mind while checking his crab pots. The inlet felt different because he now understood the source, even though the memory of the voice still lingered. He looked toward the bend where the wreck rested and thought about the crew who never returned. He continued working that season with new respect for the signals that travel across water because each transmission carried a story shaped by time and tide. He did not hear his name again and believed the loop finally failed after years of corrosion. He kept the recording in a drawer at home to remind himself that strange moments sometimes come from simple causes. He knew that calm days on the inlet now carried a quiet steadiness that felt earned after weeks of searching for answers. The stories. This park bench became the key to 5 disappearances. In many archived reports tied to a quiet suburban trail, one park bench kept showing up in every witness statement. The bench sat beside an older walking path that locals used for years, and it became the center of a strange pattern tied to 5 missing people. The story followed a 34-year-old technician named Braden Lyle, who lived a few miles from the park. He worked maintenance shifts at a small distribution center, and he often stopped by the trail after long nights on the floor. He used the spot to unwind and clear his head before heading home. His goal that morning in early autumn of 2021 was simple. He planned to sit for a few minutes and send a short message to his sister who had been asking about a ride the following weekend. Braden parked near the first turnoff, and he walked toward the bench while thinking about breakfast. The path was empty that morning, and the air felt colder than it usually did. He reached the bench, and he set his bag down while noticing fresh flowers near the base. He had seen flowers there before, but usually only 1 or 2. That morning, he counted 3 bunches, and each looked recently placed. He sat and opened his phone, and that was when he heard a faint snap behind him. He turned, but saw no one on the path. He listened for a moment, and he heard what sounded like quiet breathing near the small cluster of trees. He stood and called out a simple greeting, and he waited without moving. The breathing faded, and he felt uneasy enough to step back from the bench. A woman approached from the trail side and asked if he had heard something by the trees. Her name was Maren Ulrich, a 31-year-old caseworker who visited the trail on her days off. She pointed toward the bench and said she had seen a man sitting there 2 days earlier who vanished after dropping a small notebook. Braden asked what she meant by vanished. She explained that the man had walked toward the trees, and no one saw him leave the area based on her follow-up checks. Braden felt a chill and picked up his bag, and he asked if she had looked around for the notebook. She nodded and said she had found it under the bench. She kept it at home after failing to find a name inside. She told him she could bring it later if he wanted to see it, and he agreed since the story bothered him. She said she would return in an hour after finishing her walk. Braden stayed near the bench and looked around the clearing while replaying her account. The flowers suddenly felt more significant, and he remembered a local post from late 2020 that mentioned a missing runner who often paused near that same bench. He opened an archived article on his phone and saw a blurred photo of the bench with a date stamp. His stomach tightened when he noticed the same pattern of flowers near the legs. He walked closer to the tree line and saw a strip of cloth caught on a branch. He reached up and pulled it free, and he noticed faint mud streaks along the fabric. He placed it on the bench and took a photo for his own record. He had done informal volunteer searches before, and he knew documenting small clues mattered when nothing else made sense. A man in his late 50s entered the clearing and stopped near the bench. He introduced himself as Arvin Drexler, a retired surveyor who lived across the road from the trail. He asked if Braden was looking into the disappearances tied to the area. Braden said he was only trying to understand what happened near the bench. Arvin nodded and said he had seen similar details across several years, and each case started with someone stopping to rest. Arvin pointed to a narrow gap in the trees where old markers hung from metal hooks. He said the markers were part of an abandoned drainage project from the early 2010s. He explained that the project left several deep maintenance pits that were never fully filled, and he believed people may have fallen into an access point hidden under thick brush. Braden asked if he ever reported that theory. Arvin said he tried, but no one followed up due to limited staff and unclear evidence. Marin returned with the notebook in her hand, and she gave it to Braden. The cover felt worn, and several pages had faint impressions of older notes. He flipped through and found a short line written on the last page. It said, "Met them again by the bench after nightfall." The handwriting looked shaky, and the ink appeared fresh compared to the other pages. Braden asked where exactly she found it. She said it had been wedged between two boards under the far side of the bench. Arvin leaned closer and said he had never seen anyone place a notebook there, which made him think the writer returned recently. Braden felt the temperature shift and noticed a faint draft coming from the gap in the trees. He walked toward the marked area and pushed aside thick branches. Beneath the fallen brush, he found a concrete lip with rusted bolts. The ground dipped sharply, and a hollow space opened several feet below. He knelt and used his phone light to check for movement. He saw only old tools and a broken ladder. Yet something about the depth made his pulse race. He called out to ask if anyone was down there. No one answered, but a weak echo carried the sound back. Marin suggested checking the other side of the pit for a safer angle. They circled the clearing, and Arvin pointed to a collapsed section of fencing that partially covered another opening. Braden cleared some branches, and he spotted a shoe near the edge. The rubber looked worn, and the sole pattern matched a detail from the runner case he had read earlier. He carefully reached for it, and he noticed dry mud around the heel. Braden asked Arvin to hold his phone while he photographed the shoe. Marin stepped back to avoid disturbing the area, and she scanned the surrounding branches for more fabric. She pointed to another strip caught on a higher limb, which matched the cloth Braden found earlier. They connected the pieces and realized someone had likely moved through the gap with enough force to tear clothing. Braden called a non-emergency line and reported the discovery. He gave general details without naming the notebook and said he believed an old maintenance pit posed danger to visitors. A dispatcher said someone would check the site later, though no estimate was given. That answer frustrated Braden, and he decided to take additional photos to support the claim. As he prepared to leave, he noticed the flowers again and realized each bunch marked dates close to older missing person reports. He photographed the flowers and compared their spacing to the article images. The match felt close enough to suggest someone used the bench as a memorial or a signal. Marin suggested the writer of the notebook might have met someone connected to those flowers, and the line about meeting them again could imply repeated encounters. Braden opened the notebook once more and touched the last page. He noticed tiny indent marks above the line that hinted at a torn message. He angled the page toward the light and saw faint shapes. It looked like someone had written a location reference before removing the sheet. He took a close photo, planning to use editing tools later to enhance the impressions. They decided to walk the perimeter of the clearing before leaving, and Arvin guided them to an older fire road behind the benches. The road had cracked pavement and faded tape lines. He said he once saw a person wearing a reflective vest walking that area at night during 2018. He never identified the person, but he remembered the pattern on the vest matched old county uniforms that were discontinued years earlier. Braden connected that detail to the notebook entry and wondered if the writer had followed someone who claimed to inspect the trail. Marin said the county stopped sending inspectors to that area due to limited funding, which made the sighting even stranger. Arvin agreed and said the person may have used an old uniform to avoid suspicion. They returned to the bench, and Braden looked at the wooden boards where the notebook had been found. He noticed scrape marks near the underside. He slid a hand under the frame and found a small metal clip. It felt loose, and he pulled gently. A folded paper slipped out and landed on the ground. He unfolded it and read a short handwritten note that said, "Follow the lights near the cutoff after dark." The writing matched the notebook. Marin covered her mouth and said the message made her think someone used small lights to guide visitors toward the maintenance pit. Arvin said he once saw flickering lights near the cutoff during late 2019, but assumed they were kids playing with flashlights. Braden realized the lights may have lured curious people toward the gap. They stood silently as the idea settled. The disappearances could have been accidents caused by a hidden pit and a misleading light source. The writer of the notebook may have followed the lights and nearly fell or witnessed someone else fall. Braden suggested the writer tore out the earlier page to give it to someone, possibly a friend or an officer, yet the person never turned it in. A faint gust moved through the clearing, and Braden felt uneasy again. He gathered the notebook and folded note, and he said he would deliver them to the local station as soon as possible. Marin said she would provide her statement about seeing the notebook drop 2 days earlier. Arvin agreed to guide officers to the pit if needed. They walked back toward the parking area while discussing safer trail access. Braden looked over his shoulder at the bench, and he felt a strange pull. The bench had been a quiet place for years, yet its role in 5 disappearances seemed tied to simple mistakes, hidden hazards, and poorly understood signals left by an unknown person. The truth felt less like a supernatural mystery and more like a chain of overlooked warnings. Braden left the park with a steady resolve to push for a full inspection. He believed the answers were already there in the bench, in the flowers, and in the fragments of notes hidden under old boards. The truth only needed patient eyes to connect what had been ignored, and he hoped the next visitor would find the trail safer once those connections reached the right people. The stories. What's buried beneath that motel parking lot? In 2013, a small highway motel outside a rural town gained quiet attention after workers found strange soil layers under fresh asphalt. The case never reached headlines, but locals still mention it when strange noises come from the empty lot at night. The story centers on Rylan Mercer, who was 29 and worked as a nighttime maintenance tech at the old roadside place. He lived in a small room near the supply shed and handled plumbing issues plus late check-ins during slow months. On a chilly night in early autumn, he planned to replace worn bulbs along the back walkway before closing the service desk. He walked out toward the alley where the lot met a row of overgrown trees that blocked wind from the highway. He carried a small tool bag and wanted to finish the job before storms reached the ridge. He heard gravel shift under a passing truck but ignored it and kept moving toward the flickering lights. The first incident happened when he tried to pull a ladder from storage and felt the ground dip under his feet with a dull cracking sound. He stepped back fast because the asphalt felt soft in one oddly shaped patch near an older drainage grate. He knelt with caution and pushed a screwdriver into the crack, but found soil that felt looser than normal fill. Rylan went inside and wrote a brief note about the issue, because the motel owner wanted records of every minor repair. He grabbed a flashlight and returned outside to check the area again, since guests sometimes reported old pipes vibrating under the lot. He pressed his heel against the weakened spot and felt a faint vibration that did not match normal pipe flow. The complication grew after he asked an older guest named Hollis Grant if he had heard unusual sounds during his stay. Hollis said he heard steady tapping under the pavement around midnight 2 nights earlier. He said the tapping felt rhythmic and a slow pattern that reminded him of someone knocking through thin wood. Rylan wrote the detail in his small notebook because he wanted a full record for the owner. The next morning, he looked at archived maintenance logs stored in a dusty drawer near the office printer. He found an entry from 2009 that noted settling issues under the same section of the lot without any follow-up record. The note simply said that workers filled a shallow dip with recycled asphalt after heavy rain, but never investigated deeper layers. He walked back outside and scraped away loose chunks of pavement until he reached a thin patch of older concrete mixed with cracked gravel. He noticed faint marks in the old material that looked like parallel lines spaced evenly in a pattern similar to a box lid. He pushed his flashlight beam through the cracks and saw a dark void below the thin concrete sheet. Rylan called his friend Linton Fry, who worked part-time with a local cleanup crew that handled abandoned structures. Linton arrived after lunch and helped test the hollow area with a short steel rod used for soil checks. The rod dropped several inches into the void and produced a hollow thump that sounded too sharp for natural erosion pockets. Rylan felt uneasy but wanted clear evidence before alerting the owner. They cut a small square in the weakened concrete using an old rotary tool from the supply shed. Dust scattered across gravel as the square lifted with surprising ease. Underneath was compacted dirt mixed with thin scraps of plastic that looked melted by heat. Rylan reached in and pulled out a small strip with faded printing that looked like part of a safety warning from older storage bins. The deeper investigation started when Rylan found an old photo taped inside the maintenance log he borrowed from 2009. The photo showed the lot before renovations in 2006 and included a small storage cabin that no longer existed. A handwritten note on the back said the cabin caught fire during a storm, but details were never shared with newer staff. Rylan asked the owner about it, but only received a quiet answer that the cabin was removed after a minor electrical issue. Rylan then checked archived dispatch logs stored at the county library and found a brief call from July 2006 that reported a small fire near a roadside property matching the motel's mile marker. The call mentioned unknown materials stored inside an abandoned cabin that smoldered before firefighters cleared debris. No injuries were reported, but the log said a chemical odor lingered during the cleanup. He returned to the void under the lot and dug deeper with a small garden trowel he kept for landscaping tasks. 2 inches down, he uncovered brittle wood fibers coated in a hardened black residue that smelled faintly metallic. Linton suggested the residue looked similar to burned plastic from older industrial crates. They kept digging until the trowel struck a thin metal edge shaped like a corner bracket. They widened the hole and exposed a rectangular metal frame with charred wood inside, almost like a collapsed storage box left under the ground during repaving. Ryland found a faded barcode sticker fused to the metal, but the numbers were unreadable, except for the last 3 digits, which appeared as 416. He checked supplier records from the motel office and saw older inventory tags that used long strings, ending with the same 3 digits. The tags belonged to a discontinued supplier that shipped chemical cleaning agents in reinforced boxes. The twist came when Ryland realized the rhythmic tapping reported by Hollis might connect to shifting air pockets trapped under warped metal panels. He tested the theory by placing a board over the hollow section and stepping on different spots. Each step produced a soft knock from moving metal that echoed through the buried frame. The tapping was not from a person, but from trapped panels flexing after years of underground corrosion. He called the motel owner again with all findings and explained that the lot might contain remnants of a burned supply cabin that crews buried instead of removing fully during renovations. The owner sighed and admitted he purchased the property after the fire and assumed everything had been cleared by the previous crew. He agreed to bring in a licensed team to remove remaining material. When the cleanup team started work, they found several melted storage boxes that had fused together during the 2006 fire. The boxes contained expired solvent containers that ruptured during heat exposure. Crews confirmed the ash smell came from plastic and wood that settled unevenly under asphalt after the rushed renovation. They transported the debris to a proper disposal site and filled the cavity with stable soil. After workers repaired the pavement, Ryland walked the lot at dusk and listened for any sign of hidden noise. The tapping had stopped, and the ground felt firm under every step. He wrote a final note describing the discovery and placed it with other logs so future staff could understand the history. People still mention the motel when storms roll across the ridge because the lot glistens strangely after heavy rain. Ryland thinks the glimmer comes from newer asphalt mixing with old gravel, but he also knows that memories of buried things often linger longer than anyone expects. He told Linton the mystery felt smaller once evidence replaced fear, and Linton agreed as they locked the shed and watched distant trucks roll past on the quiet highway. The stories. The bus route no driver volunteers for anymore. Mason Kiernan had heard about Route 74 from older drivers, who spoke in quiet tones that never carried far. They said the trouble started in the late 2010s after a strange series of reports reached dispatch. Nothing dramatic was proven, yet every account shared the same route and the same stretch of road. Mason was 34 with 6 years on the job, and he handled his shifts without much worry. He covered suburban loops near a quiet industrial strip, and most days followed a predictable pattern. He enjoyed the routine since it felt steady and harmless. When his supervisor asked him to cover Route 74 one cloudy afternoon, he agreed before he remembered the warnings. He showed up early at the depot that day, hoping to review the old logbooks stored in a dusty metal drawer near the operations office. The previous drivers had left short notes that felt rushed and uneasy. One entry from late 2016 mentioned a recorded thump on the rear exterior panel that matched no visible damage. Another entry filed in early 2018 reported an unknown passenger leaving muddy prints that ended halfway down the aisle. Mason drove out a little before 4 that afternoon. The route crossed through residential blocks before curving toward the old mill road that ran along an abandoned railway cut. He planned to complete the loop without focusing on the rumors. The bus felt solid, and the passengers were few. A pair of teenagers sat near the middle seats while an elderly man checked his phone with slow movements. The incident started as Mason merged onto the mill road. His side mirror reflected something darker than the usual late daylight. He caught a shape near the tree line that looked like a person leaning slightly forward. When he blinked, the shape was gone. He told himself it was nothing unusual, since shadows often stretched strangely near wooded areas. Still, he noticed the elderly man glancing toward the same window, as if he had sensed something too. A mile later, the teenagers hit the stop cord. Mason opened the doors, and they stepped out onto a fading concrete pad. As the doors shut, one of them tapped the glass and pointed toward the rear of the bus. Mason reversed the angle of his mirror and saw a smear across the lower panel. It looked wet, like someone dragged a hand along the metal. He checked the road behind him and saw no one there. The teenager shrugged before walking away. Mason continued toward the loop turn, focusing on the sound of the engine. The noise seemed slightly off pitch. He kept his speed steady, but sensed a weight shift near the rear section. The elderly passenger moved closer and asked if everything was all right. Mason told him the engine felt warm but stable. The man nodded and mentioned hearing a hollow tapping near the back wall. At the final stop of the loop, the elderly man stepped out, leaving Mason alone for the return run. He checked the exterior panel and found the smear dry like dust pressed by a damp glove. The shape continued a few inches beyond the edge, as if the contact started slightly off the surface. He wiped it with his sleeve and felt grainy residue flake away with an odd metallic smell. He climbed back inside and started the engine. The interior lights flickered once as the gear engaged. He made it halfway up the hill before a heavy thud sounded near the emergency exit. He braked and listened. Another softer thud followed, like something shifting its weight. He walked down the aisle with slow steps and checked each row. The seats were empty, and the air felt colder than it should for that hour. Near the back seat, he noticed a set of partial prints on the floor. They were narrower than a normal shoe, but shaped like someone walking with uneven pressure. The prints stopped exactly where previous notes claimed they ended. He crouched low and found a fragment of dried soil that did not match the usual clay from the area. It held a reddish tint closer to iron dust from the old mill yard. Mason reached dispatch through the radio and reported the noises. The operator told him to return the bus for inspection, since archived calls from earlier years mentioned similar sounds. He kept the radio open as he returned to the wheel. The air inside felt charged, like static gathering before a storm. On the way back, he passed the same hill where he had seen the shadow near the trees. The mirror caught movement again. This time, he saw a figure standing perfectly still on the narrow shoulder. The figure wore something loose that blended with the background. The face seemed pale, though he could not see details clearly. The figure vanished between glances without any sign of retreat. A minute later, a faint tapping started along the rear exterior. It rose in 3 short bursts that matched a steady rhythm. He recognized a pattern similar to someone hitting metal to test thickness. He held the wheel tight and kept driving until the depot gates came into view. Mechanics met him near the garage. They checked the exterior and found thin scratches near the rear panel that shaped a curved line not caused by branches. The residue he had wiped earlier fell into a small tray and produced a metallic odor stronger than before. One mechanic mentioned that earlier logs described identical residue after drivers reported seeing a lone figure near the mill road in late 2017. The supervisor asked Mason to retrace the interior for any objects left behind. He searched each row with a handheld light. Near the same spot where the prints ended, he found a torn strip of cloth hanging from the seat frame. It felt oddly cold, even under the warm light. The cloth carried the same reddish tint as the soil fragment. Later that night, the depot reviewed old dash recordings from previous years. Most footage showed nothing more than faint reflections. However, one clip from mid-2019 captured a blurred outline moving along the side of a passing bus. The outline kept pace for several seconds before fading near the same hill where Mason saw the figure. Investigators compared the footage with archived local reports. They found mention of a worker who disappeared near the mill site in late 2015. The report never confirmed foul play, and the search ended without results. There was no official link connecting that case to the strange events on the route, yet the timing matched the earliest driver notes. Mason stayed quiet as the supervisor reviewed the findings. The bus still sat idling with a low rumble that hummed through the concrete floor. A mechanic tapped the rear panel and noted that the metal vibrated oddly like a surface recently struck from the outside. Another mechanic mentioned hearing a faint echo that felt delayed by half a second. The depot decided to suspend Route 74 until the buses could be tested. Drivers whispered that the figure near the hill might be tied to the worker who vanished years earlier. No one claimed solid proof, yet the pattern of sightings, sounds, and residue lined up too closely to ignore. The supervisor circulated a memo explaining that the route posed operational risks due to repeated, unexplained interference. Mason drove home that night feeling the weight of everything he had seen. He replayed the moment when the figure appeared in the mirror. He tried to decide if it looked like a person seeking help or a shape formed by shifting shadows. The cloth fragment still felt cold in his memory, though he never touched it again. In the weeks after the suspension, several commuters asked why the route closed. Officials told them the road required maintenance due to instability near the railway cut. Only a few people mentioned the old rumors. Some said they once saw someone walking the hill at dusk, though none described a clear face. Mason returned to his regular loop and kept his focus on safe runs. He never requested Route 74 again. Whenever the topic surfaced among drivers, he listened quietly, without adding his story. He knew what he had heard and seen on that road. He also knew that the evidence, while thin, repeated across years with unsettling consistency. The depot finally retired the buses assigned to that route. They stored them in a corner lot away from the main garage. On calm nights, staff claimed to hear soft taps on the panels as if something moved inside the old shells. No one investigated because the sound stopped whenever a door opened. Each time Mason passed the lot, he felt a chill rise along his arms. He believed the events were real, even if no official report could confirm them. Route 74 remained closed, and no driver stepped forward to revive it. The story faded from public view, yet those who worked at the depot understood why the route stayed empty. They remembered how it felt to sense a presence following the bus, and they knew some roads carry histories that never fully settle. The stories. Why the police sealed off this roadside chapel. The small roadside chapel sat near a quiet county highway where drivers sometimes stopped during long rural trips. Local deputies reportedly closed it in late 2019 after a traveler found something that changed the tone around the place. The building was simple, and people usually barely noticed it. The story centered on a 34-year-old maintenance surveyor named Corbin Hale, who often drove that route for work. He lived in a nearby town, and he usually kept to a steady schedule that involved checking rural drainage markers along the highway. On a mild afternoon in late September of that year, he planned to finish early so he could meet a friend for dinner. He stopped near the chapel because one of the markers behind it looked slanted, and he wanted to document it. He walked toward the spot while carrying a small camera and a work notebook. The chapel door stood slightly open, and he remembered hearing nothing except distant traffic. He planned to ignore the building until he heard a short tapping sound from inside. The sound made him pause, and he stepped closer to check if someone needed help. He called out a quick greeting but got no answer, which felt strange considering the soft tapping kept going. He pushed the door with his boot and saw dust drifting through a bright slant of late daylight. A wooden bench near the front looked recently moved because its legs scraped fresh lines across the floor. The tapping came from deeper inside the room, which held only simple furniture and a small cross fixed above a shelf. Corbin noticed a backpack sitting beside the far wall, which did not belong to anyone he had seen earlier. He stepped in and recorded a short clip on his camera to document the scene. The tapping stopped once he moved toward the backpack. He felt uneasy, which he later described in a written statement to deputies. He returned outside and found a driver who had pulled over to check a map. That driver, named Rhea Dunford, told police she had been there roughly 10 minutes and saw no one enter or exit the chapel. She agreed to wait while Corbin called the non-emergency line to report an unattended bag because he worried about possible travelers who might need help. Deputies arrived 20 minutes later, according to their logs, and inspected the chapel with measured caution. Inside the bag, they found a wallet and an old flip phone plus a folded printed photo of the chapel. The photo looked like it had been taken years earlier because the paint on the door in that image was a different shade. The wallet held no cards, and the phone battery was nearly dead, but it powered on long enough for one deputy to see 3 saved video clips. Those clips showed brief shots of the chapel interior taken during different seasons, which suggested someone had visited repeatedly. In each clip, a bench had been moved to a different spot, and in the final clip, a faint figure appeared reflected in the small window which faced the highway. Deputies later said the figure looked like a person crouched near the bench, though the image lacked clarity. Investigators reviewed old repair records for the chapel, which belonged to a small regional trust that handled forgotten roadside structures built decades earlier. The trust produced a file showing a volunteer caretaker named Myron Keats, who went missing in early 2009 during a routine supply run. His last note mentioned stopping at the chapel to drop off paint. No clear link existed between his disappearance and the backpack, except the printed photo which matched the photography style in a few older trust documents. Investigators searched local archives for any reported visits after his disappearance and found a single entry in 2015 from a driver who claimed to see a man moving a bench inside at dusk. That report named no suspect, and the driver never returned follow-up calls. Deputies used the phone clips to frame their timeline and interviewed residents who passed through the area before the chapel closure. One witness, named Avery Lorne, recalled seeing a tired-looking man near the highway in early 2017 carrying what seemed like paint supplies. She described him as quiet and focused on the chapel path. Her statement matched the trust note, which strengthened the idea that someone remained connected to the building for years. Investigators also compared the fresh scrape marks on the floor with older photos taken by trust volunteers. Those older photos showed the bench in fixed positions, which suggested someone had moved it repeatedly in recent months. This supported the idea that the visitor returned long after Myron disappeared. When they completed their review, they sealed the chapel for safety because they believed an unknown person had been sheltering there. The person possibly struggled with memory issues or untreated fear of being found, according to one unofficial summary shared with Corbin. They suspected the tapping sound came from the bench shifting under slight pressure, which fit with his description. The unknown visitor was never located, and no missing person report perfectly matched the wallet photo, though the style resembled a younger Myron. Authorities kept the case open, but treated it as a possible long-term wandering situation rather than foul play. Corbin later told friends that the chapel felt different when he drove past on later surveys. He thought about the way small, forgotten places can hold tangled stories that no one fully understands. He believed the closure made sense because it protected whoever might return, as well as anyone who stopped without knowing the hidden history. He still remembered the tapping sound and considered it a reminder that quiet places often carry quiet warnings. The stories. The final log from a lighthouse on a foggy coast. A faded coastal report from 2008 mentions an unsigned log found inside a shuttered lighthouse during routine maintenance. Workers said it looked recent, even though the building had been locked for years. The discovery triggered a quiet review that centered on one man named Corin Halbrook, who once served as the tower caretaker. Corin was 39 and worked as a part-time dockhand in a nearby fishing town, and he checked the old structure whenever storms rolled through. He liked the quiet building, and he felt responsible for keeping it safe because his late father had worked there decades earlier. On a cold morning in early autumn, he headed out with a simple goal, which was to finish a roof inspection before the fog returned. He hiked the narrow path with his tool pack, and he noticed the fog drifting in faster than expected. A supply boat sounded its horn, and the echo pulled his attention to shifting shapes that moved across the water. He reached the lighthouse door and found fresh scrape marks on the metal surface, and that detail threw off his routine. Inside, he heard a soft clatter from the watchroom above, and he paused because no one should have been there. He climbed the steep stairs, and the air felt heavier with each step because the tower trapped the fog that seeped through old seams. When he reached the top landing, he noticed a lantern lit on the small desk, and he knew he had not left it there earlier that week. He read the open logbook and saw an entry written in a neat hand that did not match his script. The note described a boat drifting without lights near the shoals, and the timestamp matched the previous night. Corin wondered who had written it, and he checked the radio shelf and found a handheld set powered on with low battery. He stepped outside to scan the water, and the fog swallowed most of the horizon except for a dim shape moving slowly near the rocks. He raised his binoculars and saw what looked like an old skiff listing toward a channel notorious for hidden ledges. He called a warning through the radio, and he waited for a response that never came. When he hurried back inside, he noticed another fresh line in the logbook, and it read that the skiff had no operator visible on deck. The handwriting appeared slightly rushed, and Corin felt a jolt because the ink looked wet. He checked the stairs and heard faint steps descending, even though no one passed him on the landing. He followed the sound to the service room, and he found a damp jacket draped over a chair that had been dry earlier that week. The pockets held a small notebook with water stains, and the pages carried brief notes about frequent, low fog and strange lights near the channel. The most recent note mentioned a voice over the water calling for help, and Corin closed the book because the air suddenly felt colder. He decided to document the building for safety, and he used his small camera to take photos of the fresh marks on the door and the lit lantern. He moved room to room, and he captured the damp jacket along with the notebook because he wanted evidence for the harbor office. When he checked the time, he noticed the fog outside turning a darker shade, and that sign suggested another weather shift. He stepped out on the gallery to examine the water, and he heard a low groan coming from the direction of the shoals. He could not see the skiff anymore, and the silence that followed pressed against his nerves. He returned to the watchroom and prepared to close the logbook, and that was when he noticed a final half-written entry near the bottom of the page. The unfinished line described a man on the gallery waving toward the tower, and Corin froze because he realized he had just been on that same walkway. He checked the door and found it closed tight, and he felt sure no one had entered while he moved through the rooms. He read the last words again, and the implication unsettled him more than any storm he had faced. Corin prepared to leave, and he secured the logbook under his arm because he planned to hand it over to the harbor office. As he reached the ground floor, he heard a deep thud from above, like something heavy striking the metal railing. He looked up the stairwell and saw dust drifting through the pale air, and he called out in a steady voice asking if anyone needed help. No reply came, and he hurried outside because the building felt wrong. The fog had thickened into a wall that blocked the path back to town, and he saw a faint glow near the rocks, as though the skiff lights flickered through the mist. He considered walking toward the beach, and he radioed the harbor office with a brief report of strange activity near the tower. Dispatch logs indicate that Corin's transmission cut off mid-sentence, and the signal ended with a burst of static. A search team followed the path an hour later, and they found his tool pack near the lighthouse door, but not his radio or the logbook. Witness statements described drifting voices on the water that night, and one crew member claimed he saw a dim lantern moving inside the tower. The unsigned log discovered months later matched the fragments found in Corin's notes, and investigators believed the entries were written over several days. They concluded that the skiff likely struck a submerged ledge, and they suspected Corin attempted to reach survivors through the dense fog. No further entries appeared after the final line mentioning the figure on the gallery. The lighthouse remains closed today, and the tower stands quiet during most storms. Local crews say the watchroom light sometimes flickers during heavy fog, and they assume it is faulty wiring from years of neglect. The final log stays in a small archive, where the pages still show faint stains from salt air and old sea fog, and the case sits unsolved with quiet respect for the missing caretaker. The stories. The mine shaft everyone avoids after one winter shift. Hushed stories about a troubled winter shift lingered around an old mining town where people rarely challenged its harsh land. Locals claimed the trouble began after a night when a minor accident exposed something deeper than ice inside an abandoned shaft. Ryder Halden was 34 and worked as a maintenance tech for a small mining contractor that handled seasonal repairs. He arrived in the area during early winter to inspect older ventilation lines after a storm damaged several service roads. He hoped to finish his tasks fast because he planned to drive south before deeper snow arrived. His simple goal was to check the inactive shaft called Northcut and file a routine report that usually required little effort. The incident started when Ryder reached the frozen service trail and noticed fresh tire marks that did not match company vehicles. He studied the tracks because they curved sharply near the locked entrance, and he felt annoyed since trespassing caused delays. He followed the marks for a short distance and found the company padlock on the gate sitting open in the snow. That immediately changed his plan because an unlocked gate meant he needed to walk inside and confirm that no one had entered recently. The complication grew once he stepped into the dim first chamber and heard a steady tapping sound echoing from deeper tunnels. Ryder paused because the mine had been inactive for more than 10 years, according to archived maintenance logs stored in the base office. He tried to convince himself that melting ice caused the noise, yet the tapping kept a slow rhythm that felt intentional. Nearby walls held old chalk markings that matched diagrams found in earlier reports, though he spotted one new line that seemed recently drawn. He documented the finding with his work phone because unusual markings required clear evidence for supervisors. The photo captured a faint boot print beside the chalk line, and that raised his concern further. Ryder checked the archived inspection sheets stored on the local server earlier that morning, and none mentioned any recent site visits other than his. He decided to walk deeper because standard protocol ordered a full sweep whenever unauthorized signs appeared. He carried a small lantern since the wired lights no longer functioned after their power source was removed several years prior. During his investigation, he followed the tapping while keeping his pace slow, and he noticed the pattern shift whenever he stopped moving. Ryder wondered if frozen beams strained under winter pressure, yet the sound seemed too controlled to match structural stress. The tunnel floor held dusty rail tracks once used for small carts, and he saw scattered debris that did not appear in previous photos taken during a 2018 inspection. Among the pieces, he noticed a bent metal badge with faded lettering that seemed older than the shutdown date. He recorded its location because older equipment sometimes surfaced during thaw periods, and supervisors liked accurate notes. The tapping finally ceased near a narrow drop that led to a secondary shaft called split turn, according to age diagrams. Ryder checked archived calls from the company emergency line on his tablet because the area once hosted minor cave-ins, and he found one brief report from 2009 that mentioned a missing day laborer whose case ended without clear closure. The record did not list a name, and Ryder assumed it was a typical incomplete file from seasonal hiring cycles. Still, the timing of the tapping felt too strange and forced him to rethink his assumptions about the site. He crouched near the drop and shined his lantern downward, where he spotted a small fabric scrap wedged between two beams. The scrap looked newer than the surrounding decay, and he recognized the color because it matched safety jackets issued during recent winter shifts at the company depot. Ryder felt uneasy because no crew members reported missing gear that month, and the depot logs showed no issued jackets beyond standard signouts. He reached for the scrap carefully and noticed dried dirt on its underside, along with faint char marks that resembled contact with a heated surface. As he studied the scrap, a distant metallic clang echoed from behind him, which made him turn quickly. Ryder called out for any possible trespasser, and his voice bounced through the tunnels without a reply. He replayed earlier photos on his phone to compare debris positions, and he realized a thin wooden plank on the floor behind him now leaned at a sharper angle. He felt certain he did not touch it earlier, so he took another photo, planning to discuss it with security because possible movement indicated human presence or shifting beams. Ryder climbed out of the narrow section and moved toward the first chamber, using the lantern to check each corner. On the way, he discovered a shallow scrape on the wall that looked freshly made, and the chalky dust sat loose on the ground below it. He checked his steps carefully because he wanted to avoid contaminating the scene before proper documentation. He snapped a photo and noted its timestamp for supervisors, who required clear tracking of each entry detail. As he reached the first chamber, the cold air felt sharper and carried a faint burnt scent that had not been present earlier. Ryder scanned the floor for heat sources but found only patches of frost that melted near the gate. He felt confused because the temperature should have dropped consistently inside an inactive shaft during winter storms. His attention returned to the open padlock because fresh scarring around its hinge suggested someone forced it quickly rather than using a key. He stepped outside and followed the tire tracks up the service trail. The sun hung low and gave the snow an orange tint that made details easier to spot. Ryder found a second set of prints beside the tire marks, which looked like boots with shallow tread, and the stride pattern suggested a slow walk. He recorded this because incidents involving unauthorized visitors required complete documentation for liability protection. The prints led toward a bend where the snow deepened around an old equipment shed with a cracked metal roof. At the shed, he found the door slightly ajar and signs of recent activity like disturbed dust and dragged footprints. Ryder pushed the door open and found a large portable heater tipped on its side with a melted patch around its vent. The heater model matched units removed from service years earlier due to overheating risks, and he knew they remained stored at a warehouse miles away. Ryder checked the shed floor and found more scraps of the same jacket material he collected earlier, which suggested a link to the heater incident. Tapping returned faintly from the direction of the mine, which forced him to choose between returning to safety or completing his sweep. He paused because protocol permitted retreat when structural risks arose, yet he believed the evidence required a clearer connection. Ryder replayed the metallic clang in his mind and concluded that the noise did not match natural stress shifts. He walked back toward the gate with steady steps while comparing earlier tire tracks to ensure no new marks appeared during his absence. Inside the chamber again, Ryder traced the tapping to a side tunnel sealed during the 2009 incident mentioned in archived calls. The seal consisted of old boards nailed across the tunnel mouth, yet one board sagged as if recently disturbed. He lifted his lantern and saw soot on the edges that resembled the heater melt pattern from the shed. Ryder removed gloves and checked the temperature of the soot but found it cold, which meant the disturbance happened earlier. Behind the boards, he noticed another chalk mark shaped like a short horizontal line above a circle. He tried to recall earlier diagrams and realized this symbol appeared in a forgotten annex report describing temporary holding zones used for equipment staging. Ryder removed a loose board and peered into the dark opening where he saw a narrow pit with metal fragments scattered along its base. Among them, he saw a torn patch of the same jacket color that seemed older with deeper dirt embedded in its fibers. He lowered his lantern deeper and noticed something else, A structural support beam bore a fresh dent shaped like the corner of a heater casing. He understood then that someone tried to use older gear to heat part of the tunnel, possibly to locate or free something buried under the pit. This linked the heater scrap, soot marks, and scorch on the jacket pieces into a single sequence, suggesting a recent search attempt. Ryder backed away because he realized the person or people involved might still be nearby. Before leaving, he noticed his lantern flicker and then regain strength. The tapping stopped again, which heightened his urgency. Ryder stepped out into the open trail and felt the frozen wind strike harder as he reached his truck. He contacted dispatch and requested a site lockdown due to signs of unauthorized entry and possible hazardous activity. Dispatch promised to send a team after sunrise, since travel remained dangerous during heavy winter. A follow-up investigation reportedly found additional heater fragments inside the shed, along with prints that matched no employees. Witness statements from nearby residents mentioned a person seen in a bright jacket entering the service trail 2 nights earlier. No one confirmed the identity, and footage from an old roadside camera offered only a blurred outline walking toward the gate. The pit area remained sealed after teams scanned it with ground sensors that detected minor voids but no confirmed remains or trapped equipment. Ryder later reviewed his photos and noted that the chalk symbol above the circle matched older maps that marked forgotten test zones unrelated to recorded accidents. Supervisors concluded that someone might have misinterpreted the old reports and attempted an unapproved search inside the shaft. They reinforced the gate and added warning signs that urged people to avoid the trail during winter shifts. To this day, the mine shaft remains closed, and locals still talk about the tapping that drifted through it that season. Ryder kept his notes stored on his tablet because he believed the sounds came from shifting beams rather than any hidden person. Yet he understood why others felt uneasy when passing that trail, especially when winter storms made the land crack and echo in unpredictable ways. The stories. This photograph found in a mailbox changed everything. The photograph turned up inside a rusted mailbox behind an old duplex that once housed 3 families during the late 2010s. It reportedly connected to an unsolved disturbance that drew police cars for weeks without any formal statement from local officials. Rylan Mercer was 32 and worked as a junior claims adjuster who spent most days reviewing accident photos sent by clients across the region. He had driven out to the duplex to help his cousin move into a cheaper place after a messy breakup that happened earlier that year. He wanted a quiet afternoon with simple tasks that could end before dark, since the neighborhood felt uneasy even in daylight. The plan changed when he noticed the leaning mailbox behind the fence with its lid jammed open from years of sun damage. Something inside caught the light in a way that bothered him, and he reached in without thinking much about it. His hand closed on a stiff envelope with no stamps and only a smudged date that looked like it read 2014. Inside was a single photograph that showed the back lot of the same duplex, with a figure standing near a basement door. The figure seemed to stare at the camera, even though the face was blurred under the bright reflection that hit the glossy print. A handwritten note on the bottom edge read, "He never left," and the words felt rushed, as if written during real fear. Ryland showed the photo to his cousin, who shrugged and said the basement had been locked for years due to repeated flooding. His cousin had heard faint stories from the previous tenant, who claimed someone used to sleep down there during colder months. Nothing in the story felt sharp enough to explain the strange energy captured in the photograph. Ryland slipped the photo in his backpack, then walked around the duplex yard for a better look at the angle shown in the print. He matched the line of the fence and the shadows from a nearby power pole until he reached the exact spot where the unknown person once stood. His phone timestamp showed late afternoon, yet a sudden chill moved through the air even though the day had been warm. He took a quick photo of the canal behind the duplex to document conditions, since he handled evidence types for work and trusted that habit. Something shifted behind the basement door, and he stepped back while telling himself it was only loose wood pushed by the wind. The handle rattled once, which unsettled him more than he expected. A neighbor named Corby Henshaw walked out from the adjacent unit and asked if Ryland was looking for the old inspector who used to check the lot. Corby looked about 50 and carried a half-empty grocery bag that gave off a faint scent of detergent and onions. He said the inspector came around every few months to confirm no one had broken into the basement. Ryland showed Corby the photo, and the man stiffened before saying he recognized the reflection pattern on the figure's jacket. Corby claimed the image matched a maintenance worker named Talon Griggs, who vanished from the property in late 2014. According to Corby, the disappearance never gained attention because Talon was young and moved often without telling anyone. Rylan asked if police ever searched the duplex, but Corby said they mostly checked paperwork, then suggested Talon left town for seasonal work. Corby lowered his voice and explained that several tenants reported hearing dragging sounds under the floor during storms after Talon went missing. Rylan listened with growing concern because the basement clearly leaked heavily and could hide debris without much notice. He returned to the basement door and studied the warped wood for any sign of fresh marks that might show recent attempts to enter. A faint groove near the latch suggested someone had slipped a tool inside within the last few months. His job trained him to recognize forced entry signs, even when the damage seemed minor. Rylan decided to search public records at the small municipal office across town to see if any maintenance reports mentioned Talon. An older clerk named Mavis Kelter helped him check archived building logs that covered routine inspections and emergency calls. She located a brief entry from late 2014 stating that the maintenance worker assigned to the duplex never completed his shift. The entry ended with a note about a tenant hearing a loud crash near the canal path behind the property that same evening. No follow-up report existed, which troubled Rylan because something clearly disrupted the worker's schedule. Mavis encouraged Rylan to check the microfilm station since older incident summaries sometimes went unprocessed in the main system. He scrolled through grainy reels until a short police dispatch log from early the next morning appeared with a simple description of possible trespasser behind duplex. The log ended without resolution, yet two initials of responding officers matched names Rylan recognized from regional accident investigations. It remained unclear why the officers never wrote a complete summary. Rylan contacted a former coworker who now handled risk assessments for vacant structures and asked if he recalled any issues near that duplex. The coworker remembered an odd request from a landlord who wanted an estimate for reinforcement of a basement hatch rather than a full cleanup. That recommendation was denied due to insufficient documentation, which meant the door probably stayed weak for years. Rylan returned to the duplex the next morning and found the backyard quiet except for the hum of distant traffic along the main road. He held the original photograph beside the current view and noticed a missing gutter downspout that once directed runoff away from the basement. Water had carved a shallow trench that led directly to the exact spot where tenants heard dragging noises during storms. He moved closer to the door and pressed his ear against the wood to check for echoes that could reveal hidden cavities behind the interior wall. A faint hollow sound suggested a gap large enough to hide debris that might include personal items left by Talon. He reached for the handle, which gave slightly, as if someone recently replaced a rusted hinge without securing it tightly. Corby approached again and warned Rylan that previous tenants avoided the basement after a courier discovered an old backpack wedged behind a drain pipe. The courier returned the bag to the landlord, who claimed it belonged to a temporary worker, yet no one retrieved it. Rylan realized this detail lined up with the approximate time of Talon's disappearance. He asked Corby where the landlord moved and learned the man relocated to another county after selling the duplex in 2021. Rylan checked property records later that day and found a short transfer note indicating the landlord left behind several unclaimed storage boxes. Those boxes were marked as low priority during cleanup, which meant their contents might still sit in a small maintenance shed. Rylan walked to the shed behind the duplex and spotted 3 dust-covered boxes stacked under a sagging roof tile that drooped toward the canal. Inside one box, he found scattered papers, including an old shift sheet with Talon's name and a checklist mentioning repairs near the basement hatch. Another page listed a complaint about a foul smell rising through the floorboards after heavy rainfall. He took photos of the papers, then looked up when a sudden gust rattled the shed door hard enough to shake loose dried leaves. The wind pushed a loose shingle that clattered onto the ground near his feet and broke apart in a puff of dust. The noise startled him, but reminded him that the property had been poorly maintained for years, which supported the idea of an overlooked accident. Rylan returned to the basement and used a small pry bar from his cousin's toolbox to loosen the frame without causing obvious damage. The door opened with a dull crack that carried through the quiet yard like a tired breath escaping from a sealed room. A wave of stale air rolled out, followed by the faint scent of metal and wet soil. He stepped inside and turned his phone flashlight toward the far wall where the drainage pipe curved behind a pile of rotten boards. Something glittered near the edge of the light, and he reached down to pick up a crushed reflective jacket with a missing zipper. The reflective pattern matched the same glare seen on the figure in the original photograph. A small utility tag sewn to the jacket listed the initials TG, which aligned with Talon Griggs, and confirmed Rylan had found evidence connected to the missing worker. He dug through debris nearby and uncovered an old clipboard that held one final maintenance note describing a sudden collapse caused by shifting soil near the hatch. It suggested Talon was preparing to reinforce the area before something destabilized the ground. Ryland followed the damaged soil path toward a narrow cavity under the floor where water pooled during storms and carried loose items into deeper pockets of mud. He found scattered tools with dried corrosion that indicated the worker likely became trapped by collapsing debris during heavy rainfall. The shifting soil and poor structure could have hidden the incident from sight for years. He contacted local authorities who reopened the case and confirmed the basement conditions created a perfect scenario for an unnoticed accident involving a lone worker. Officers documented the findings and credited Ryland's persistence for revealing the long-ignored evidence that connected the photograph to the missing maintenance report. Corby watched from the fence with a quiet expression that mixed relief with sorrow. Weeks later, Ryland returned to the duplex before his cousin finished moving in and paused near the mailbox where he first found the photo. The rusted metal still leaned forward, as if trying to offer one final warning about secrets left unmanaged in quiet neighborhoods. He understood now that the image was not a threat, but a trace of someone trying to signal unfinished work. He placed a small flower near the fence, then stepped back toward his car while thinking about how easily small details vanish when people move on. The photograph no longer felt ominous because its message became clear through patient evidence and careful listening to forgotten reports. Ryland left with a quiet respect for the worker whose final shift had been frozen in that single frame. The stories. What a night janitor found behind the vending machine. Roughly 10 years ago, a late shift incident at a small distribution center led to a report that never reached public records. The file described something a night janitor found behind a vending machine after a quiet shift turned strange. Ryland Cho worked nights at a regional packing warehouse on the edge of a mid-sized town. He was 37 and had been there almost 7 years. He liked the silence after midnight and usually finished his route with music in his earbuds. On this particular night, in late spring of 2014, he wanted to clock out early and get home before a storm hit the valley. He started in the loading bay with a simple goal for the night. Finish his checklist, empty the bins, and mop the narrow hallway near the break room before the wind picked up outside. The building felt colder than usual, and the air system made a steady hum that covered most small sounds. The incident began around 1:30 in the morning when Ryland passed the break room and saw the vending machine screen flick on by itself. The machine had been glitchy before, so he did not think much of it until he noticed the light did not show the usual bright menu. Instead, it looked dim with a strange gray shimmer moving across the glass. A soft tapping sound came from behind the machine. Ryland stepped closer and asked out loud if someone was stuck. He expected no reply. The tapping repeated 2 times with steady rhythm. He backed up a little and checked the doorway leading to the maintenance hall. No one else should have been there since the last forklift crew left hours earlier. He went to find the shift supervisor, but realized he was alone for the next hour since the supervisor had gone to the far lot to handle a truck issue. Ryland returned to the break room and watched the machine again. The shimmer on the screen grew lighter, then faded. He unplugged the power cord to reset it, and the tapping stopped. When he pushed the machine slightly, he felt something resist from behind. The machine sat tight against the wall with no gap. He moved it a few inches and saw a narrow, dark space behind the right side panel. Something metallic glinted inside the space. Ryland grabbed his small work light from the janitor cart and angled the beam toward the opening. A metal box covered with dust sat wedged between the drywall and the machine frame. The box looked old. The lid had a faded sticker with part of a name scratched off. He reached in and pulled it free. Inside were 3 items: a small bound notebook, a thin plastic badge with a photo rubbed almost blank, and an audio recorder the size of a deck of cards. The notebook smelled musty. The first page held uneven handwriting, saying property of Hale Dorn, who worked maintenance from 2003 to 2008 based on a short training archive. Ryland later checked. Ryland remembered hearing from older staff that Hale left suddenly after a safety investigation. Nothing official remained in the shared files. Most said he moved away. A few said he had filed complaints about strange vibrations near the break room wall. Ryland opened the notebook carefully. The first entry from early 2006 described recurring knocking sounds near the vending machine as well as faint static pulses in the wall during night shifts. Hale wrote that he made several unofficial recordings, but none stayed consistent when reviewed later. The next entries grew more detailed. Hale noted timestamps, short sketches of sound waves, and small maps of the hallway layout. One entry from late 2006 described a night when the machine screen flickered with a gray wash, similar to what Rylan had seen hours earlier. Hale wrote that the tapping seemed to follow his movements around the room. Rylan turned to the last written page dated mid-2007. It read, "I need to get someone to check the wiring before this gets worse." The lines after that looked rushed. Hale wrote that he found a small access hole behind the machine with a narrow duct running into the maintenance room. He believed air pressure changes inside the duct caused some of the sounds. The next note stated, "I still hear something moving in there, although the duct should be empty." Rylan set the notebook down and inspected the audio recorder. It contained a small tape with a handwritten label that read Night Shift Sample 2. He slipped it into his pocket with the plan to listen later under better light. He then checked the badge. The image showed Hale with short hair and tired eyes. The back listed his role as maintenance support. Rylan pushed the machine farther from the wall to look for the duct mentioned in the notes. A narrow circular opening near the baseboard revealed an old service channel that ran behind several rooms. It had not been used in years based on the dust and cobwebs. The channel connected to the maintenance room and likely carried air back when the building used a different system. He crouched closer and felt a cool draft from deep inside the channel. The draft moved in a steady pulse instead of a constant stream. When he leaned nearer, he heard a faint scrape followed by two soft taps. He jumped back and called out if anyone was inside. No reply followed. Rylan stood still and waited for another sound. 3 minutes passed quietly. He reached into the opening with the work light and shined the beam across the first few feet. Dust floated in the narrow space and nothing moved. The scrape sound did not repeat. He repositioned the vending machine and photographed the channel opening so he could show the supervisor. He then finished his route feeling uneasy. When his shift ended at 3, he took the notebook and recorder home. Later that afternoon, he listened to the tape. It began with low background hum, likely from the old air system. 30 seconds in, a rhythmic tapping started. It matched the pattern Rylan heard earlier. The tapping repeated 4 times, then stopped. Hale's voice spoke quietly, saying, "I know the duct is empty, yet it keeps making that pattern." The tape ended with a short static burst. Rylan cross-checked the tape with archived maintenance logs from 2006 available through an internal server. He found a note about air pressure complaints near the break room, but no follow-up reports. The log mentioned Hale's concern about a possible leak inside the service channel and recommended an inspection that never occurred. Rylan met with the supervisor the next night and showed the findings. The supervisor listened to part of the tape and agreed that the sound pattern matched what past crews mentioned during older shifts. He filed a report to the facilities manager, who arranged a full inspection later that week. The inspection team removed the vending machine and opened the service channel. They found a partially detached metal flap deep inside that moved when the air system cycled. The flap created repeated taps during pressure changes, which explained the pattern recorded by Hale. Inspectors also found old tools left behind by a previous contractor, which caused the scrape Rylan heard. The team sealed the channel, repaired the flap, and recommended replacing the vending machine wiring due to aging components that caused the strange screen flicker reported by both Hale and Rylan. 2 weeks later, the warehouse returned to normal. The tapping never came back. The recording was archived inside a general maintenance file, and the notebook was stored with other historical documents kept for internal reference. Rylan kept thinking about how one small discovery behind a vending machine connected him to someone who tried to document the same odd sounds years earlier. He believed Hale had tried to solve a problem that no one else seemed to notice until the notes surfaced again. The story lives quietly inside a handful of reports, and one old tape that proves how simple overlooked issues can create experiences that feel much stranger than they are, especially during long nights when empty hallways amplify every sound. Corin prepared to leave, and he secured the logbook under his arm because he planned to hand it over to the harbor office. As he reached the ground floor, he heard a deep thud from above, like something heavy striking the metal railing. He looked up the stairwell and saw dust drifting through the pale air, and he called out in a steady voice, asking if anyone needed help. No reply came, and he hurried outside because the building felt wrong. The fog had thickened into a wall that blocked the path back to town, and he saw a faint glow near the rocks as though the skiff lights flickered through the mist. He considered walking toward the beach, and he radioed the harbor office with a brief report of strange activity near the tower. Dispatch logs indicate that Corin's transmission cut off mid-sentence, and the signal ended with a burst of static. A search team followed the path an hour later, and they found his tool pack near the lighthouse door, but not his radio or the logbook. Witness statements described drifting voices on the water that night, and one crew member claimed he saw a dim lantern moving inside the tower. The unsigned log discovered months later matched the fragments found in Corin's notes, and investigators believed the entries were written over several days. They concluded that the skiff likely struck a submerged ledge, and they suspected Corin attempted to reach survivors through the dense fog. No further entries appeared after the final line mentioning the figure on the gallery. The lighthouse remains closed today, and the tower stands quiet during most storms. Local crews say the watchroom light sometimes flickers during heavy fog, and they assume it is faulty wiring from years of neglect. The final log stays in a small archive where the pages still show faint stains from salt air and old sea fog, and the case sits unsolved with quiet respect for the missing caretaker.